Good day. I'm working on Erasmus Weekly Wraps. I am Viv Govender. And usually what we're going to do is going to start off with a general market segment and end up with a tech segment. So in this week's tech segment, we're going to discuss CoreWeave's IPO, as well as the emergence of new entries to the AI space. And then in our general market segments, we're going to start off by discussing, again, what's the latest with Donald Trump. This time around, it's going to be back to tariffs. Then we're going to discuss what Europe is going to be doing over the next little while and whether or not it now might be time to be bullish on Europe. And then finally, in the we're going to look at China's focus on consumption. So let's start off with the latest in Donald Trump world. Trump again pushed forward tariffs on Mexico and Canada. This happened about a month ago before he basically kind of called them off. It seems that there's a chance that it's going to happen again this time. I honestly don't understand this particular strategy he's using right now with Canada. Many of the things he does, I can understand, even if it's for reasons I may not agree with. You can argue about, for instance, the deportation, orders he's put out for, illegal immigrants. You can stay within the too, strict or they're too aggressive, or not. But you can say there's a reason behind it. You can even argue USAID. Why is he doing that? There you may not agree with it, but and it's probably overall harmful to the world and the US in particular. But it probably works, for his own personal reasons behind the fact that. I think the USAID, with its funding of NGOs, etc., globally, probably is a source of funding for a lot of people that are anti-Trump, and in some ways this does feed back into efforts against his administration. So maybe that's an agreement there. But with Canada and Mexico, there's no reason to do these tariffs. There's no, especially around Canada. I mean, Mexico, you might argue, has not been as cooperative as they should be around immigration control, etc. But there's absolutely no reason to do these tariffs against Canada. There's no huge, smuggling problem across Canada border. He talked about fentanyl, but I mean, Mexico basically is the route for over 1,000 times more fentanyl than comes through from Canada. So it can't be that. It's not about immigration to a large extent, because yes, there is illegal immigration from Canada. People choose to enter Canada and then make it to the US. Someone that did that in the past, though not illegally, was Elon Musk. He went to Canada and went to the US. But it's not a huge issue. Certainly not the kind of issue you would expect from the southern border. Canada has been a strong ally of the US. It's fought in every one of the US's wars recently. It's had soldiers die for the US. It's basically a totally safe border to the north. It's a source of a lot of raw materials, etc. And if there's a trade deficit between the US and Canada, it's primarily because the Canadians are selling things like oil to the US. Not just because they are basically trying to, restrict the export or the import, of manufactured goods and so on. It's just they have a lot of natural resources, and the US wants it. So it doesn't really make sense as to why he's going after Canada, but he is. I suspect it's some kind of personal petty grievance against maybe either Justin Trudeau or the Canadians themselves. I suspect the reason he's anti-Ukraine is nothing to do particularly with the Ukraine itself, but I think he's kind of anti-Zelensky and some other people in the Ukraine because of the first impeachment trial, which was around the whole Ukraine situation, where he basically tried to pressure the Ukrainians to find dirt on Joe Biden, and they refused. Yeah, it is a bit of a mystery there, but the global implications are quite bad. If he's willing to do these kind of things against Canada, the UK, Europe, so forget about places like China, are not safe. South Africa are not safe. And though it's not as important to us, the US market, as for instance it is to Canada, it's still not an insignificant market. And the real danger around these trade wars is that once, for instance, the US has a trade war with the Europeans, for instance, the Europeans won't just put up tariffs against the US, they'll put up tariffs in general in many areas. And so you might find a general restriction of trade to the EU. And the same thing would happen in China and other places in the world as well. If somehow, the rest of the world can cooperate and basically impose tariffs on US goods, but not on each other, it will significantly reduce the possible dangers to the world, even though there is still going to be a significant amount of danger, because the US is more than a fifth of global GDP. Next, looking at what's been happening with regards to China. The Chinese basically have come out and said that they are looking to actually have more children's consumption. They said they will focus a bit more on consumption. This is positive. I do think that in terms of what's happened in China over the last several years, we've seen a lot of infrastructure development. We've seen a lot of building of capacity. And they may have gone overboard in that. There's many cases of what's called bridges to nowhere in China, where you basically build roads and there's no real demand for it. They have these ghost cities, huge cities that they built with no real demand for them. And, if they want to stimulate that economy, they probably want to have a bit more, economic growth coming in. I do think that, it's being driven by consumption as opposed to being driven just by overseas consumption or, building infrastructure. If you look at most of the modern world, South Africa, the US, Europe, they are driven by consumption. And I think if the Chinese want to basically have a long-term prospect of growth, and they have to develop into a country which has a significantly larger consumer base. They cannot just rely on exporting stuff to the rest of the world. And a big positive about actually having a locally strong consumer base is that your locals basically consume more, by definition. That means they actually get to enjoy more fruits of their labor, which I think is something that every mature economy probably wants to try to maximize. And then let's move on to Europe. We've talked about tariffs, so we talked about what's happening in China. The Europeans are responding to Trump and to some of the moves globally by becoming a lot more coordinated, moving a lot faster than some people had thought. In terms of building up their defense, industries. Now, I still think it's not likely that they're going to get up to, speed fast enough to do much to help the Ukrainians if the US pulls back entirely. And the US, by the way, has pulled back to quite a large extent from the Ukrainians. Without US support, Europe currently does not function as a proper military. Yes, there are, people in like France and, the UK and Germany who have died fighting with the US. But in general, they have been like add-ons to the primary force of the US. They would not have been able to do these kind of things in places like Afghanistan, etc., without US support. If the US pulls out, they don't just basically up their own spending. They've got to restructure how they spend as well to replace the US's core, or central position in their defenses. There's also the idea that seeing that the US is basically becoming a lot more, protectionist on things like tariffs, that the EU might decide to have more of a local industry. Now, I'm even less optimistic here than I am about the military options, because the military options, there's maybe a way down the path down the line where they will get in things in order, even though it might not be soon enough for Ukraine. But when it comes to basically trying to boost growth in the European Union, I'm quite negative about that. There's a number of factors against it. Firstly, the Europeans have kind of relied on the US spending. Military spending to basically have above normal levels of welfare, payments. So everyone knows that the European Union or Europe as in general has very generous payments for people with disabilities and so on. I saw a recent stat that was amazing. 1 in 5 cars bought in the UK was bought for people on a disability grant. 1 in 5. And I've been to the UK. 1 in 5 people does not have a disability in the UK. Certainly not disability at a level where they are going to be given a grant to purchase vehicles with the government. But that's the case at the moment. So there's a huge welfare net there. And the demographic situation in Europe is bad. Maybe not as bad as places like China or Korea, but pretty bad. You're talking about aging populations across the entire continent. Nowhere basically has a non above replacement or even a replacement level population growth or fertility rate. The best I think is like places like France, but even they are well below it goes 2. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough time. They probably don't have the willpower to cut on welfare. So yeah, I think it's good to hear them talk about it. But until we get to a point where, for whatever reason, the politics in Europe change to the extent where they're willing to cut things like welfare payments, where they're willing to basically go off and really restructure their economies, much less regulation, etc. I think this is a bit of empty news. And so yes, there is a bit of positivity coming in out of the EU at the moment, especially since it's been lagging so dramatically against the S&P for the last decade plus. But I still, if I had to bet where I'd rather have my money for the next 10 years, I'd rather have it in the US than in the EU. And then finally moving on to some of our tech news. So starting off with CoreWeave. This is a new AI company that's looking to have an IPO. They're looking to raise about $4 billion on a $35 billion valuation. The problem with this company is that a lot of its business is very focused on a couple of customers. And I think, for instance, Microsoft is the biggest customer, and they have about a third, or just about a third of the total revenue for this company. And in fact, we've seen recently Microsoft actually started to pull back some of their spend on CoreWeave's technology. Now, what's interesting about this is not just CoreWeave's IPO, it's also, I think we're getting to a point where we should be seeing some new AI companies looking to list. Now, we haven't seen, or many of these AI companies listing. I would think of things like, for instance, Anthropic or OpenAI or XAI, even internationally, things like Mistral, etc. They've gotten raised a lot of money from private markets. They've gone out to places like, SoftBank or, Elon Musk with some of his funds he's raised from different, people out there. And, Anthropic with, I think it's partnership with places like Amazon and so on. And you have seen that these guys have gone out and they've raised huge amounts of money, but they haven't done it in the public market. They've done it in the private market. And obviously, we haven't come to a point just yet where these guys are generating enough revenue to justify the amounts of money they're spending on things like, new developments, new training models and so on. But I think we're getting close. We've seen, for instance, OpenAI come out and announce the possibility of a thing like a $20,000 package, monthly package. I mean, they started with $20 for the usual. They had a $200 package, and now they're talking about the possibility of a $20,000 package. When you have, enough people paying $20,000, you can justify a lot of, a market cap. XAI with Grok has done really well. Perhaps it might be listing it as part of a Twitter listing. Who knows? Anthropic has been a bit more reticent about all these kind of things. They're about the most safety aware of the AI companies, and therefore they haven't been pushing quite as hard as other people out there. But even they would probably be able to raise some money. And there's other things, for instance, like Perplexity AI. There's maybe, the guys from the deep seek guys might want to list in China or something. So there's been a lot of possibilities, but nothing has come out recently. You haven't seen a new company, quite frankly, a big new company that's dependent on AI listing. And this would be the first. So let's just see how this goes. Let's just see if the market's willing to take, this new listing out of the positivity. And if it does, I think we might see, more listings going forward from here. The last thing you want to have happen is like a Stripe situation where you have a company growing into maturity effectively without ever listing. Why don't we want that? It's because we as retail investors won't be able to access this. Yes, the private market investors, private equity guys and so on have put money into Stripe, and they've made a lot of money out of it. But without these companies listing, the average retail investor like you and me will not be able to access this growth. And so we need to see these AI companies list. We need to see them on these stock exchanges, if only for the ability of the general person out there to take advantage of some of the benefits or some of the returns rather on AI. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks for having me. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Cheers.